You possess a rare, unyielding essence that naturally repels the trivial chaos of modern life, shifting the gravity of every room you enter simply by owning your space. Take a moment to ground yourself right here, absorbing the sudden stillness that emerges when a truly formidable force decides to stop playing by everyone else's rules. For a long time, the crowd attempted to orchestrate your narrative from the sidelines, confidently broadcasting your impending failure and mapping out your defeat as if they owned the copyright to your future. They engineered elaborate scenarios of your ultimate unraveling, entirely convinced that their collective noise would dictate your limits. Yet, there is a sublime brilliance in how spectacularly their calculations collapsed. The individuals who tried to orchestrate your descent are now left staring at a reality they can neither comprehend nor replicate. It is an exquisite defeat for them, especially since they gambled their entire reputations on your absolute ruin, only to watch you step out of the shadows with a definitive clarity that comes from surviving what was meant to destroy you. The entire environment completely lost its voice the second you stopped seeking permission, creating a vacuum where their grand predictions used to live. The moment you anchored yourself in your own worth, the energetic field adjusted permanently, forcing your detractors to feel the immediate chill of their own irrelevance. They meticulously attempt to project indifference, desperately trying to mask the fact that your ongoing evolution completely destabilizes their sense of security. They eagerly sought to reduce you to a cautionary tale, but now they cannot even attempt to validate their own status without checking if your trajectory eclipses their entire existence. Their fragile assertions of superiority instantly crumble like dry leaves underfoot whenever your path intersects with theirs, leaving them completely exposed. Seeing you thrive amidst the very obstacles they threw in your path, looking completely detached and sovereign, is the exact reality that shatters their logic. If you are ready to feed this precise momentum back into the world, cementing a frequency that leaves mediocrity completely paralyzed, make sure to engage with this space and align your focus with this growing current. The absolute truth that none of your critics will ever vocalize is that your execution throughout this entire transition was utterly flawless. Every engineered obstacle thrown in your path was quietly repurposed. Every strategic trap they laid out was dissected with surgical precision, and every attempt to diminish your stature was immediately converted into raw kinetic momentum. The cosmic order is making it abundantly clear that your apparent stillness was never stagnation. It was the ultimate accumulation of power. Everything shifted the exact moment you abandoned the exhausting cycle of self-justification, effectively ending their artificial winter and allowing your genuine authority to manifest. You ceased bargaining for basic recognition and instead established a standard of excellence that requires absolutely no verbal defense. You discovered that maintaining your absolute composure wasn't a passive stance, it was a highly sophisticated masterclass in grand strategy. Observe how frantically they are scrambling now, clumsily attempting to alter past events and revisioning their history to imply they were supportive of your journey all along. Their speech has grown quiet, their movements hesitant, and their expressions carefully guarded because they know their artificial goodwill is entirely transparent. You left them completely paralyzed without offering a single counterargument, without compromising your dignity, and without shrinking to accommodate their small horizons. You adjusted your internal standards so completely that the entire environment had to rewrite its parameters just to stay compatible with your presence, rendering revenge entirely obsolete because your multidimensional growth became the ultimate conclusion. It is critical to realize that the opposition never actually feared your shortcomings. Their true terror stemmed from the possibility of you manifesting your ultimate potential right where they attempted to suppress you. They were terrified of the exact moment you would awaken to your inherent sovereignty, fearing your unbreakable poise, your calculated withdrawal, and your inevitable renaissance. They deeply dreaded the instance when the illusion would shatter and you would recognize that you were never operating from a position of disadvantage. You were the inevitable shift in reality that they desperately pretended wouldn't arrive. Remember how they traded rumors in the dark, treating your predicted destruction as a foregone conclusion and celebrating your challenges as if it were a competitive sport. Yet, while they were wasting their currency on speculation, you were isolated in your laboratory, methodically restructuring your life element by element, turning every single setback into an intellectual upgrade, becoming sharper, more analytical, and intensely focused. You didn't merely endure the low points, you underwent a complete systemic evolution. You successfully navigated through psychological terrains that would have entirely dismantled the average person, emerging with an absolute lucidity that can neither be simulated, purchased, nor confiscated. This is precisely why they appear so utterly disoriented today, because every single one of their pessimistic predictions dissolved upon contact with reality. The most profound realization in all of this is that you never actively sought the validation of a platform or chased the superficial warmth of a crowd's attention. Your current positioning was earned through absolute resistance, by maintaining your center when the entire structure around you was applying maximum pressure to force a compromise. You claimed your authority by completely refusing to allow their distorted projections to dictate your baseline reality, choosing to remain unyieldingly authentic in an ecosystem populated entirely by synthetic personalities. Because of this adherence to truth, you have become the massive variable that completely upends their entire calculation. Reflect on the specific crises that threaten to completely erase your progress. The seasons where you felt entirely unappreciated, misunderstood, and discarded by your peers. The broader intelligence of the universe was carefully monitoring your silent accumulation of structural strength, watching you forge an impenetrable psychological armor out of every single disappointment, broken contract, and mockery directed at your vision. You were completely unaware at the time, but you were meticulously engineering a version of yourself that would eventually force your detractors to completely retract their entire narrative. Now you are standing firmly in the clearing, navigating the aftermath like an individual who has fully integrated their intrinsic power. Your triumph doesn't require loud declarations or flashing signs. It manifests as the kind of profound authority that forces competitors to avoid direct contact, compelling those who questioned your validity to completely reassess their own identities. This transformation reframes you from an underestimated variable into an absolute force of nature that can no longer be contained, categorized, or minimized by outside forces. They are completely incapable of dampening a fire they did not kindle, and your seamless navigation of this transition has left them completely unanchored. Welcome to a completely upgraded paradigm where your journey is the standard they discuss with reverence, where crossing your path is their greatest operational regret, and where you have emerged from the crucible vastly superior to their entire script. This is your definitive timeline, and reality is no longer dropping subtle hints, it is validating your position with absolute clarity. Now that the immediate storm has cleared and the profound stillness surrounding your life speaks infinitely louder than their synthetic confidence ever could, the directive is to completely lock in your focus. This is the precise juncture where the elite practitioners of self-mastery sharpen their long-term vision while the uninspired crowd quietly retreats into the background. Before we systematically deconstruct this architectural blueprint phase by phase, ensure you anchor your attention here to keep this momentum expanding exponentially. View this alignment as your personal signature on the historical moment you permanently rewrote the rules of engagement, leaving every single cynic who gambled on your surrender completely immobilized. If you are fully prepared to inhabit this new era of absolute mastery, where you executed every single move with expert precision and left your opposition entirely incapacitated, make sure to leave your mark of alignment in the comments below. If you possess the structural integrity required for this level of performance, you will feel an undeniable gravitational pull to analyze this breakdown to its absolute conclusion, because the insights that follow are not mere observations. They constitute the definitive manual for the version of you they never anticipated. True mastery begins when your absolute non-participation becomes their greatest psychological burden, leaving those who predicted your collapse completely unraveled by your refusal to engage. Strategic withdrawal is fascinating because it doesn't need to shout, posture, or aggressively demand the center of the room. It simply maintains its absolute center, entirely unmoved, while the systems designed to diminish you begin to fracture under their own weight. They were fully prepared for a loud confrontation, a defensive explanation, or the chaotic emotional exchange they desperately required to sustain their own narratives, but instead, you presented them with a total informational vacuum. No defensive feedback, no validation of their metrics, and absolutely no emotional energy for them to exploit. That complete absence of reaction inflicted a far deeper disruption than any aggressive counter-strategy could have achieved. They anticipated noise, so you initiated a total blackout. They sought a chaotic environment, so you demonstrated absolute self-regulation. They attempted to pull you down into a low-frequency debate, but you left them to cycle through their own internal toxicity alone. This is exactly why they are currently suffocating, not because you engaged them in battle, but because you completely disqualified them from your reality. Their entire psychological stability is completely predicated on receiving a reaction, since insecure individuals require external attention to simulate a sense of existence. The exact moment you halted the energetic supply and ceased entertaining their peripheral noise, they began to choke on the density of their own unhealed insecurities. It is a beautiful manifestation of systemic balance, a brilliant, high-level strategic repositioning executed with mathematical precision. Their minds are spinning in endless loops, desperately wondering why their provocations fail, why your dignity remains unblemished, and why you feel zero compulsion to validate your choices, failing to realize that you have already secured the definitive outcome. Victory is inherently quiet, orderly, and deeply calculated, reflecting the rhythmic stability of an individual who recognizes that their truth requires absolutely no external defense. By choosing absolute stillness, you became an unyielding mirror that reflects their own internal disorganization, and that specific confrontation is what they find completely intolerable. Reflect on the vast amounts of time they spent analyzing your profile in the dark, treating your potential missteps as if they were a spectator sport, entirely convinced that they could force an emotional breakdown if they just applied enough social pressure. Instead, you executed the ultimate pivot. You smiled internally, shifted your trajectory, and continued walking as if their engineered chaos didn't even register on your radar. That refusal to react was never a retreat. It was an act of absolute psychological dominance, a profound checkmate that bypassed their entire defense system. Have you ever observed how individuals become increasingly loud and erratic the more powerless they feel? How their gossip intensifies when their personal substance diminishes, and how they invent entirely fictitious narratives when the truth fails to support their desired status. Their noise is nothing more than a defensive camouflage, whereas your silence forces the ultimate revelation of their character. The moment you exited their game, they were left screaming into an empty canyon, entirely aware that your lack of feedback wasn't born of confusion, but of an absolute realization of your value. You permanently understood that your worth is never a subject for negotiation, and you stopped trying to explain macro-level visions to micro-level minds. Every advanced individual eventually arrives at this exact evolutionary threshold where reality presents the ultimate law. Conserving your energetic currency isn't a limitation. It is an acknowledgement that your focus is far too valuable to waste on low-yielding assets. You embraced this truth with a structural maturity that completely shattered their defensive egos, which is precisely why their gaze shifts uncomfortably whenever your name is introduced, why their vocal inflection drops, and why their superficial confidence wavers. They are completely paralyzed by the fact that you simply outgrew the entire matrix they tried to confine you in. Consider the objective data. Strategic non-engagement has dissolved far more empires than active warfare ever could, because entire conflicts completely disintegrate the moment one party simply declines to validate the battlefield. That is the exact blueprint you executed. You simply stepped off their playing field and left them to exhaust themselves fighting their own projections. Now they are completely drained, paranoid, disoriented, and deeply embarrassed, haunted by the undeniable reality that you operated like an absolute elite professional while they tripped over the complexity of their own petty designs. Your refusal to participate did far more than protect your peace. It acted as a total exposure mechanism, stripping away every single layer of their social signaling and forcing them to confront exactly who they are when they no longer have your life to critique, attack, or blame. They are now permanently trapped with their own internal landscape, devoid of distractions, devoid of a target, and completely out of excuses, left staring directly at the unresolved aspects of themselves that they have avoided for a lifetime. This is why the silence is so profoundly deafening, why it reverberates through every social circle they enter, and why they physically flinch at the mere thought of you prospering without giving their existence a single thought. They attempted to place a barrier on your trajectory, only to walk directly into a complete structural lockdown within their own lives. The exact darkness they tried to project onto your future has manifested as their permanent weather forecast. They are now forced to inhabit the exact storm they engineered, drowning slowly in the toxicity they hoped would overwhelm your career. Their superficial blessings have completely dried up, their synthetic confidence has cracked wide open, and their manufactured smiles have tightened into masks of pure survival. And the absolute best part of this reality? You never had to engage in a single conflict. You didn't offer a single argument, you didn't launch an exposure campaign, and you didn't waste a single second seeking revenge. You simply focused on your healing, committed to your expansion, and maintained your alignment while their own chaotic energy dragged them deep beneath the surface. Perhaps your analytical mind occasionally asks, why did the systemic feedback take this long to manifest? Why didn't the universe intervene immediately? It is because true balance is highly clinical. It never operates on the frantic timeline of human emotion. It strikes at the exact psychological juncture where the lesson will inflict the maximum evolutionary impact and deliver the ultimate realization. You kept moving forward, kept upgrading your code, and kept ascending, and the natural mechanics of reality ensured that every single step you took moved you exponentially further away from the structural chaos that they are now forced to call home. Imagine them right now, pacing the floor in the dead of night, desperately replaying every single deception, every coordinated attack, and every synthetic smile they used to mask their profound envy. They aren't experiencing genuine remorse, they are experiencing absolute terror. They aren't drafting apologies, they are panicking over their lack of options. They aren't evolving, they are simply drowning in the exact consequences of their choices. You didn't destroy their structure, their own output imploded it. Let them sit permanently in the environment they manufactured. Let them wrestle with the storm they actively summoned, and let them choke on the bitterness they once aimed directly at your destiny. You owe them absolutely nothing, not your forgiveness, not your attention, and certainly not your sympathy. Balance never misses its mark, it is entirely incapable of failure, and it never gets confused. They are finally learning that they could never outrun their consequences, because the feedback loop was moving directly toward them from day one. Step back and let them bark, because a celestial body never compromises its orbit over the localized noise on the street. Gossip is the definitive national anthem of the completely powerless. It is the permanent soundtrack of individuals who possess zero meaningful momentum in their own lives, forcing them to latch onto your name like it's the only source of actual relevance they will ever experience. They will bark, howl, whisper, and repeat the same tired narratives, desperately hoping that their collective noise will somehow disrupt your internal stability. But you simply remained entirely sovereign, radiating excellence, maintaining your trajectory and navigating your own universe while they circled like stray scavengers looking for any scrap of your attention. Every single word they muttered wasn't a critique of your life, it was a loud public confession that screamed, "I am entirely consumed by envy, I lack the capacity to replicate your results, and talking about your journey is the only way I can feel alive." Imagine the utter absurdity of the spectacle. A confused crowd gathered at night, pointing frantically at the moon, screaming at the top of their lungs trying to convince the world that it is falling from the sky. Yet the moon offers absolutely zero response. It simply continues to rise, continues to radiate, and continues to dictate the tides of the entire planet regardless of their opinions. That absolute refusal to validate their existence is what completely scorched their egos. You refuse to lower your standard, you decline to bark back, and your silent execution exposed their total lack of substance far more brutally than any confrontation ever could. They were never actually analyzing your flaws, they were merely broadcasting their own profound limitations to the world. And you might have occasionally wondered, why did the collective environment seem to entertain their narratives initially? Why did anyone grant their nonsense a single moment of attention? It is because a lie can sprint with immense speed over short distances, but it possesses absolutely zero endurance. Deception is a short-term variable. Truth is an immutable constant. Over a long enough timeline, the structural fractures in their stories inevitably began to show. The surrounding environment began to notice the thick layer of bitterness behind every syllable and the obvious desperation dripping through every single sentence. The world watched your exponential expansion and their steady decay side by side, and the human mathematics resolved itself naturally. Your compounding success became an unanswerable rebuttal that they could not talk over. Your undeniable glow became empirical evidence that they could not distort, and your effortless rise manifested as a psychological blow they never saw coming. Picture them clearly right now. Their voices are fading into irrelevance, their fabrications are completely collapsing, and their temporary social currency is evaporating into nothingness. They are literally choking on the exact same noise pollution they generated, while you continue to ascend in a silent frequency that they are entirely unauthorized to interrupt. That is the ultimate systemic penalty. Your elevation completely erased their entire narrative from existence. Let them continue to gossip, let them continue to bark, and let them spin fictional stories that completely dissolve the very second you step into the room. They are nothing more than background noise, and you are a peak they lack the equipment to reach. They are frantically running laps chasing your shadow, completely blind to the fact that they are entirely incapable of generating their own light. Your critics have been sprinting in desperate circles around the exact same matrix of misery for years, recycling the identical lies, nursing the same ancient grudges, and repeating the exact same outdated stories so many times that even their own subconscious minds have completely tuned them out. They are running hard, sweating profusely, and slipping into absolute panic, yet their actual position hasn't shifted a single inch. They are merely orbiting the exact same psychological darkness that completely swallowed their own potential a long time ago. Meanwhile, you simply stepped off their track entirely, advancing onto a high-level vector that their limited sight cannot even scan. You aren't competing in their race. You are rising vertically above their entire dimension. Imagine the sheer futility of their behavior. A group of individuals aggressively chasing a shadow cast on a wall, clawing at the drywall, screaming at the silhouette, fully convinced that capturing it will somehow grant them the power they lack. But a shadow has zero substance, and you are already miles ahead, completely locked into the pursuit of something tangible, authentic, and deeply aligned with your ultimate destiny. They desperately try to brand their behavior as objective criticism, but it is nothing less than a profound obsession wearing a highly fragile mask. And the realization will occasionally surface in your awareness. Why are they so intensely incapable of looking away? Why does my name remain a permanent fixture in their vocabulary, and why can they never seem to transition to their own affairs? It is because your continuous evolution serves as a permanent, flashing neon sign that highlights the life they completely refuse to construct for themselves. Every single step you take toward your grand objective casts a blinding light on their total stagnation. Every win you add to your record serves as a brutal notification of the dreams they actively abandoned, and every milestone you hit screams a truth they cannot unhear. You chose evolution while they chose decay. They are chasing ghosts while you are chasing greatness. They foolishly believed the game was determined by horizontal speed, assuming that coordinated gossip and strategic noise would somehow delay your arrival. They thought keeping your name active in their mouth would somehow anchor your reality to the same low level they occupy. But true advancement doesn't operate on a horizontal plane. It is entirely vertical. The exact moment you cut off the feedback loop, stopped fighting their distractions, and withdrew your attention, you exited their racetrack completely. They are left running in chaotic circles on the ground while you are climbing through organizational levels they lack the structural courage to even contemplate. Visualize them attempting to manually capture smoke with their bare hands. That is the exact state of their hostility today. Their hands are grasping frantically at an asset they cannot touch, cannot impede, and can never compete with. You didn't secure the win by outrunning them on their level. You won by outgrowing their entire matrix. They can never catch you because you no longer exist in the coordinate system where they left you. Let them chase the silhouettes on the wall. Let them replay their outdated grievances like a broken digital audio file stuck on an infinite loop of bitterness. Let them remain entirely obsessed with a historic version of your identity that doesn't even exist anymore. You are already living in your future, constructing a reality that their cognitive limits cannot even process. They are permanently locked into repeating yesterday, while you are entirely occupied engineering tomorrow. They didn't actually harbor a passion for causing you distress. They were simply profoundly addicted to the high-value attention you granted them while they tried. Your opposition never actually cared about your ultimate downfall. Their true objective was your reaction. They desperately wanted to hear your voice waver, wanted to witness your energetic currency leak, and wanted to see you wasting your intellect explaining your choices to people who aren't even qualified to share your air. Their entire collective ego was constructed on the fragile illusion that they possessed the leverage to pull your strings and dictate your emotional baseline. But then you executed the ultimate sovereign maneuver. You simply walked away without a single word. And in that singular moment of detachment, their entire artificial empire of control suffered an immediate, catastrophic structural collapse like a wet paper tower. Visualize the biological reality of the dynamic. A parasite firmly attached to a host organism, consuming every ounce of vitality it can extract to sustain its own weak system. Then, without warning, the host simply steps into a different environment. Calm, silent, completely unbothered, and the parasite is left suspended in empty space, thrashing wildly with absolutely zero life force to feed upon. That is their exact operational reality right now. They are panicking, flailing, and facing a total systemic shutdown because the absolute source of their power, your focus, has been permanently removed from the equation. They completely miscalculated your baseline kindness, assuming it was an open invitation to compromise your boundaries, but your absolute silence corrected that error with immense clarity. Initially, they attempted to increase the volume, launching far more absurd fabrications and orchestrating bigger provocations, desperately fishing for even a micro-expression of frustration or a temporary flinch. Because within the broken logic of their ecosystem, your pain was the only empirical proof that their existence actually mattered. But you didn't offer a single flinch. You didn't cast a single glance backward, and you completely refused to supply their fire with oxygen. Devoid of your energetic currency to sustain their structure, their collective ego began to face an absolute starvation crisis. Their vocal delivery cracked, their social confidence shriveled into nothingness, and their small audience grew completely bored of the repetitive show. Their entire identity, which was built entirely on the premise of trying to disrupt your life, dissolved right inside their own hands. Perhaps an analytical part of your mind observes their behavior and wonders, why does their hostility seem to intensify the further I move ahead? It is because absolute indifference is the most lethal penalty you can ever deploy against a narcissist. Hostility they can process, anger they can easily repurpose as fuel, and active conflict is a game they know how to manipulate. But absolute silence? Silence delivers a devastating, unanswerable message that screams, "You are entirely irrelevant, I have completely outgrown your dimension, and you do not possess an active profile in my world." Imagine them right now, literally screaming into a complete void, desperately hoping that anyone will validate their noise, feigning a confidence they do not possess, and trying to spark a fire in completely empty rooms. Every single attempt they make to damage your status now inflicts double the damage on their own psychology, because it serves as a brutal reminder that you are no longer receiving their signal. You didn't have to actively dismantle their infrastructure. Their ego suffered a total systemic death the exact second you stopped feeding the machine. Let them continue to spiral into darkness, let them grasp frantically at the smoke, and let them choke on the sheer desperation of their position. You are never returning to that level, and deep down they are fully aware of it. Your absolute indifference is the closure they desperately tried to avoid, and the exact consequence they completely earned. They operated under the delusion that your silence would effectively erase your presence from the field, entirely unaware that your actual existence would transform into a permanent monument that highlights everything they failed to become. You have zero requirement to swing an instrument, elevate your vocal tone, or actively pursue a campaign of revenge. You simply continue to draw breath, execute your strategy, and scale new heights, and that baseline reality functions as an absolute psychological nightmare for the very individuals who guaranteed your failure. Your continuous acceleration operates as an absolute slap to their logic. Your daily progress acts as an intense sting to their ego, and your unshakable peace functions as a devastating blow to the entire foundation of their identity. They attempted to permanently bury your potential under a mountain of engineered skepticism, but now, every single forward step you take transforms into a definitive funeral march for the deceptions they once celebrated. Imagine the ultimate irony. An individual spending years meticulously assembling a highly distorted caricature of your life, spreading malicious narratives like seeds they fully expected would grow into your ultimate ruin. Instead, every single milestone you achieve manifests as a scorching sun that instantly reduces those fabrications to absolute ash. Every environment you enter with total confidence transforms into a clinical courtroom where their false accusations receive an immediate death sentence. Every single victory you secure becomes an unyielding reflection that they cannot escape, because deep down in their consciousness, they know that truth completely shattered their fiction without you ever having to state a defense. They don't actually fear the loss of your presence. Their true terror stems from being forced to watch you become everything they explicitly swore you lacked the capacity to achieve. And the question will inevitably interface with your awareness. Why does my simple existence generate such a massive volume of psychological discomfort within their circle? It is because you are the living, breathing evidence of their wasted years. You are the empirical proof that execution matters, while excuses are entirely worthless. You are the permanent, digital scoreboard that they cannot outrun regardless of how fast they try to spin their stories. They consciously negotiated for comfort and convenience, while you actively embraced the pain of transformation. They clung desperately to their petty jealousy, while you meticulously constructed ironclad discipline. They hid behind synthetic narratives, while you scaled the mountain using raw truth as your anchor. This is exactly why they cannot escape your presence. Not because you are pursuing them, not because you mention their names, but because their own fractured conscience speaks infinitely louder than your silence. Picture them sitting in isolation, scrolling through the data of your victories, their chests tightening and their minds frantically replaying every single interaction where they underestimated your resolve. They don't actually harbor hatred for your person. They harbor an intense hatred for the devastating reflection of their own shortcomings that your success forces them to confront. They are completely incapable of unseeing the objective data. While they remained entirely paralyzed in their stagnation, you kept evolving your code. While they remained trapped in the mud, you scaled the heights, and while they were busy whispering, you were busy executing. You don't need to draft a revenge strategy. Your lifestyle is the revenge. Your very existence shatters their narrative, your glow completely invalidates their excuses, and your compounding evolution completely dismantles their ego. You didn't have to actively destroy them. You simply became entirely undeniable. And now, every single breath you take serves as a permanent notification that they gambled against the absolute wrong individual and lost everything on a massive scale. They meticulously drafted what they fully believed would be your final chapter, completely blind to the fact that you held the exclusive authorship rights to the entire script from day one. They genuinely navigated reality under the assumption that the story was over for you, believing that the orchestrated betrayal, the coordinated fabrications, the digital smear campaigns, and the backstabbing would break your structural integrity so completely that you would never be able to re-establish your baseline. They mapped out your predicted failure like a grand theatrical premiere, rehearsing their smug expressions and practicing their victory speeches, completely unaware that their hostility was acting as the exact catalytic fluid required to activate the seed of your absolute greatest phase. Imagine the supreme comedy of their position. They close the book with immense satisfaction, walking away with an arrogant grin assuming the narrative is finalized, and then in the dead of night, the volume opens itself. The pages begin to radiate raw power, rewriting the architecture of the story, and expanding into a multidimensional masterpiece that is completely wild and utterly unstoppable. That is your reality right now, the massive, uncalculable plot twist they were entirely unequipped to manage, the absolute system upgrade they cannot compete with, and the Category 5 storm they completely failed to detect on the horizon. They tried to confine your potential within a prison of social isolation, completely failing to understand that stillness is the exact environment where elite strategists sharpen their weapons. Every single attempt to suppress your voice merely amplified your resonance. Every orchestrated betrayal failed to weaken your center and instead forged an unbreakable psychological core. Every loss was immediately integrated as an invaluable data point, and every single fracture in your experience transformed into an opening where raw, unyielding power could flood the system. You didn't break down, you simply upgraded your software. You didn't shatter, you recalibrated your entire trajectory. You didn't vanish into obscurity, you underwent a complete molecular transformation. And yes, the analytical query will naturally challenge your mind. Why did the path require this specific volume of pressure? Why did the universe allow these variables to push my system to its absolute limits? It is because kings are never manufactured in environments of convenient comfort. They are meticulously forged in the core of the furnace. And now you are standing firmly in the center of the arena, not merely surviving the elements but completely dominating the entire ecosystem. Imagine them observing your current output, their eyes wide with disbelief, their breathing shallow and erratic, desperately trying to comprehend how an individual they completely wrote off has returned looking absolutely untouchable. They are completely incapable of stopping the loop in their minds, entirely unable to alter the data, and completely trapped in the reality of your ascent. You aren't merely a storm they failed to predict. You are the clinical reckoning they explicitly earned with their own actions. This isn't the conclusion of your book. This is the exact moment the entire narrative shifts permanently in your favor. The final chapter they tried to draft for your life wasn't your conclusion. It was the definitive beginning of their permanent regret and your legendary renaissance. They completely failed to disrupt your structure, and instead, they merely shattered the outdated version of your identity that was willing to tolerate their presence. Here is the definitive section that your journey truly commands, the precise realization that completely exposes the ultimate truth your critics desperately hoped you would never decode. Your absolute internal peace is the most catastrophic penalty they will ever have to process. They spent vast amounts of energetic currency trying to fracture your spirit, disrupt your sleep cycles, cloud your clarity, and undermine your confidence. And now that you have fully stepped into an upgraded iteration of yourself that is entirely composed, intensely focused, and completely beyond their reach, that exact alignment is tearing their psychology apart in dimensions you will never have to personally monitor. Visualize the structural irony. They spent a lifetime training for chaotic conflict, sharpening their vocabulary for street warfare, rehearsing complex arguments, practicing psychological manipulation, and building elaborate mental simulations where you would completely lose your composure under the pressure they generated. But now you don't even acknowledge the invitation. You refuse to respond to the frequency, you don't offer a single flinch, and you navigate your daily execution with a level of internal peace so remarkably steady, grounded, and effortless that your mere presence feels like an immediate existential threat to everything they believe about their own status. They marched out hoping to shake your foundation, but they ended up completely destabilizing their own identity. They were never actually afraid of losing your connection. Their true panic was triggered by the clear realization that you were outgrowing the operational requirement for their existence. Your absolute composure acts as a continuous spotlight that exposes the internal disorganization they have been hiding from their entire lives. It provides the collective environment with an undeniable contrast that clearly illustrates who was genuinely chaotic and who was truly integrated, who was radiating toxicity and who was committed to expansion, and who was merely pretending to have substance versus who was entirely real. Their external noise used to penetrate your field because a part of your nature still harbored the hope that they would eventually understand the purity of your intent. But the precise second you realized you have zero operational requirement to prove your value to a single soul on this planet was the exact second the laws of reality handed you an internal dominion that they are completely powerless to manipulate. Let us break down the mechanics exactly how advanced minds analyze data. They find your peace entirely intolerable because it serves as empirical proof that they never possessed actual leverage over your life. They cannot stand your silence because it completely reveals the total uselessness of their attacks. They cannot stand your acceleration because it acts as a permanent critique of their stagnation. They cannot stand your glow because it forces their shadows into absolute visibility, and they cannot stand your structural stability because they constructed their entire identity on the anticipation of watching you fall apart. Imagine them right now, pacing their floors in a state of absolute cognitive dissonance, overanalyzing every past conversation, frantically trying to decode your strategic moves, digging through networks for updates, and stalking your public success as if it were critical breaking news. They are constantly forcing themselves to confront questions that their egos lack the capacity to answer. How did they repair their system with this level of velocity? How are they remaining completely unaffected by our campaign? What is the source of their continuous acceleration, and how did they secure a total system upgrade without our participation? Why has our engineered chaos completely ceased to register on their radar? Your internal peace haunts their consciousness because it represents the single asset that they can neither steal, simulate, nor destroy. It articulates a definitive narrative without deploying a single word. It validates your complete evolutionary upgrade, highlights their absolute decline, and utterly annihilates their ego. And most catastrophically for them, it forces the realization of just how completely irrelevant their existence truly was in the grand architecture of your destiny. They operated under the delusion that the battlefield required aggressive fighters, but you proved that the standard of the era belongs exclusively to masters of architecture. Your peace isn't a passive surrender, it is a highly advanced weapon system. It is the absolute stillness that completely swallows their noise, it is the absolute clarity that exposes their chaos. It is the structural integrity that completely neutralizes their childish temper tantrums, and it is the vertical elevation that leaves them completely gasping for a baseline in a storyline that they no longer have access to. And you might find yourself asking, why is internal peace the specific variable that inflicts the most devastating damage on their psychology? It is because it forces them to view a crystal clear projection of what they could have experienced if they hadn't completely compromised their own access. It shows them exactly what they squandered through their own arrogance, providing an objective demonstration of what actual maturity looks like, and structural maturity is a language they never took the time to learn. Imagine them watching your trajectory today, prospering with absolute discretion, navigating reality with fluid ease, resting with complete security, moving with undeniable authority, and walking with absolute clarity of purpose. For their psychology, that contrast is absolute torture. Not because you are actively inflicting harm, but because you healed so completely from their toxicity. Your internal composure is the definitive evidence that you systematically cultivated strength in the exact coordinates where they attempted to fracture your code. You stabilized the entire system right where they tried to introduce maximum volatility, and you conquered macro-level dimensions they didn't even realize you were tracking. You didn't transform into a cold, unfeeling machine. You simply achieved absolute structural clarity. This dynamic exists because the absolute law of your journey dictates this final reality. The most devastating counter-strategy isn't social influence, market dominance, or obvious triumph. It is absolute, unyielding internal peace. Not the forced persona of calm, not a simulated stance, but the genuine, unshakable alignment that manifests naturally once you permanently sever the connection with every single variable that once attempted to compromise your energy. They tried to engineer an environment of chaos, but you constructed an unyielding empire of peace. They tried to dominate your emotional baseline, but you achieved absolute mastery over your internal architecture. They attempted to place a ceiling on your future, but you completely rewrote the entire parameters of reality. Your internal alignment is their absolute apocalypse because it is the single asset they can neither influence, silence, duplicate, nor kill. And that is the most exquisitely designed conclusion that they never saw coming. Now that every single truth has been clinically extracted into the light and every synthetic mask has completely fallen away, it is mathematically obvious who successfully navigated the crucible and who was completely consumed by their own friction. You didn't merely survive the transition, you completely redefined the final output of the entire equation. This is your definitive era, sovereign soul. and absolutely nothing in their arsenal possesses the leverage to pull your reality back down into the shadows you have permanently outgrown. If this frequency fully matches your current alignment, solidify your focus, lock in your momentum, share this activation with an individual who requires this exact caliber of structural strength, and let us continue expanding this power to its absolute zenith.